The Cost of Everything. A story of betrayal, forgiveness, and the grace that finds us anyway. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Matthew 5:44. Here is something that will make you uncomfortable. Every 11 seconds, an older American is targeted by a financial scammer. Every 11 seconds. And the people who do this, the people who sit at a desk or a kitchen table or a rented office and dial the numbers of elderly men and women and construct elaborate, patient, deliberate lies designed to extract every dollar those people have spent a lifetime accumulating. Those people are not monsters from a movie. They don't look like villains. They sound like friends. They learn your name. They ask about your grandchildren. They call on your birthday. And some of them are very, very good at what they do. James Scott was one of the best. This is not his story. This is the story of Walter and Edna Moseley of Clarksville, Tennessee. Married 53 years, members of Grace Hill's Seventh-day Adventist Church for 31 of those years, owners of a modest house on Birchwood Lane with a vegetable garden in the back that Walter tended with the focused devotion of a man who believed deeply in the dignity of growing things. They lost everything, and what happened after that is the reason this story is worth telling. Before we move forward with the story, please like and subscribe and help us to grow this channel to uplift more people. To understand what was taken, you have to understand what was built. Walter Moseley was 74 years old, a retired electrician who had worked for the same contracting company for 31 years before his knees made the decision his stubbornness wouldn't. He was not a complicated man, which was different from being a simple one. He had strong opinions about coffee. It should be black, it should be hot, it should be drunk in the morning before anyone expected anything from you. He had strong opinions about people. They were mostly decent and mostly trying, and the ones who weren't were usually carrying something they hadn't learned to put down yet. He read his Bible every morning, slowly, without hurry, in the recliner by the window that looked out at the garden. He had read it cover to cover 9 times. Edna Moseley, 72, had spent 30 years as a school librarian, a career she described as the most quietly important work a person can do with a conviction that made it inarguable. She was the kind of woman who remembered the name of every student who had ever checked out a book she recommended, which was a large number of people over 30 years. She made jam from the garden. She ran the hospitality committee at Grace Hills with the organizational precision of a military operation softened by genuine warmth. She called her 2 adult children every Sunday and her 4 grandchildren on their birthdays without fail, without prompting, with a card in the mail that always arrived on the actual day, not the day before or after. They had built over 53 years of 2-income frugality and careful living, and the kind of patient financial discipline that doesn't make for interesting stories but makes for secure retirements. They had built a life of modest, real abundance. Their house was paid off. Their car was 5 years old and ran perfectly. And in their retirement accounts and savings, accumulated over 3 decades of steadfast contribution, they had $240,000. It was not a fortune by any measure that would impress the kind of people who consider fortunes. To Walter and Edna Moseley, it was everything. It was every overtime shift. It was every vacation they'd taken somewhere modest instead of somewhere extravagant. It was the new roof they'd put off for 2 years, and the kitchen renovation that never happened, and the cruise they'd always meant to take and kept meaning to take, and had finally, at 74 and 72, decided they might actually do next spring. It was 40 years of ordinary sacrifice made visible. It was also, as of a Tuesday afternoon in March, completely gone. Let us be clear about who James Scott was. Not because he deserves the attention, but because clarity is a form of protection, and this kind of person is more common than we want to believe. He was 34 years old, presentable, The kind of presentable that is deliberately cultivated, because presentation is a tool when your income depends on being trusted. Medium height, clean cut, with a broad, practiced smile that reached his eyes because he had spent considerable time in front of a mirror ensuring that it did. He drove a leased BMW he couldn't actually afford, wore a watch that looked expensive and kept an office in a business center on the good side of Clarksville that rented desks by the month and conferred the appearance of legitimacy on anyone who used its address. He had worked in 3 states under 4 different business names in the past 6 years. He had never been charged with anything. He was, in the language of the people who study such things, a high-functioning predatory fraudster, which meant he was intelligent, adaptable, emotionally controlled, and completely without the interior friction that most people call a conscience. James Scott did not lose sleep. He had arranged himself through years of practiced self-justification and the carefully selected philosophy that everyone is selling something, and he was simply better at it than most. He had arranged himself so that he genuinely did not experience what he did to people as harm. He experienced it as business, as a transaction in which he provided a service, hope, excitement, the feeling of being seen and valued and specially chosen, and received compensation. That the compensation was their life savings and the service was fictional seemed to James like a distinction people made because they couldn't handle the fundamental transactional nature of human interaction. He was, in clinical terms, a textbook narcissistic sociopath, but he didn't think of himself that way. He thought of himself as pragmatic, as results-oriented, as someone who understood how the world actually worked beneath the stories people told themselves about it. He had identified Walter and Edna Moseley through a data list purchased legally, grotesquely from a marketing company that identified retired homeowners in mid-sized southern cities with indicators of accumulated savings. He had done preliminary research, their address, their approximate ages, Walter's LinkedIn from years ago that still listed his employer and retirement date. He knew before he ever called them that they were churchgoers. He knew because church membership was on the list, flagged as a demographic marker. He filed it under useful. Not because he was going to attack their faith, that was too obvious, because people of faith, in his experience, were inclined toward trust, toward the presumption of good intent in others, toward the charitable interpretation of motives. It made the early stages of the relationship easier. He picked up the phone. He called Walter on a Wednesday morning in October. He introduced himself as a financial consultant, specializing in senior investment portfolios. He had a company name, Meridian Asset Partners, with a website that had been live for 4 months and looked authoritative and clean. He had fake testimonials, a fake Better Business Bureau rating, a fake suite of services described in the confident, slightly opaque language that financial services tend to use because its vagueness is a feature, not a bug. His pitch was not aggressive, that was the first thing. He didn't call with an urgent opportunity or a limited-time offer or any of the red flags that financial literacy pamphlets describe. He called with a question. I'd love to learn more about your current financial situation and whether there are strategies you haven't been offered that might serve you better, going into your 70s and 80s. Walter was not naive. He had been told by his children and by his pastor and by the financial segment on the local news to be careful of phone solicitations. He told James he wasn't interested. James said, "Of course, I completely understand. Here's my number if you ever want to talk. No pressure whatsoever." He called back 6 weeks later, not with a pitch, but with a piece of free information, a change to IRS regulations affecting retirement distributions that was real, accurate, and genuinely useful because James Scott always led with something real. It was the architecture of trust. Give something true first, so the lies that come later are colored by the credibility of what came before. Walter mentioned it to Edna. Edna said it was interesting that he'd called just to share information with no ask. That was the second call. There were 11 more over the course of 4 months. James learned their names, their children's names, their grandchildren's names. He remembered. He asked follow-up questions. He was warm without being sycophantic, professional without being cold. When Walter mentioned that he read his Bible every morning, James said he had grown up in a Christian home, which was true in the same way a house is true regardless of whether anyone lives in it. He mentioned his late grandmother's faith. He said he had always respected people who took it seriously. Walter liked him. This was the thing that would be hardest for Walter to sit with afterward. He had liked James Scott. Genuinely, he had told Edna that the young man reminded him a little of their son David, not in looks but in bearing, in the ease of him. He had said more than once that it was nice to deal with someone who didn't seem like they were rushing towards something. James Scott was always rushing towards something. He had simply learned to look like he wasn't. By February, he had proposed the investment, a private equity vehicle targeting renewable energy infrastructure with projected returns of 11 to 14% annually, higher than standard market returns, but not so high as to trigger the skepticism that genuinely spectacular promises trigger. He had a prospectus. He had charts. He had references from 3 satisfied clients who were, in fact, phone numbers that rang to pre-recorded voicemails or to associates of his who knew their scripts. Walter's son David, a mid-level manager in Nashville with 2 kids and a mortgage, told his father it sounded too good. He said it over Sunday dinner in March, quietly, not wanting to embarrass his father in front of Edna. He said he'd like to have his own financial advisor take a look at the prospectus first. James, when Walter mentioned this, was untroubled. He had a response prepared. He told Walter that he completely understood, that he encouraged due diligence, and then he mentioned, carefully, almost casually, that the window for this particular vehicle was closing at the end of the month, as they had nearly reached their investor cap. Not pressure exactly. Just a fact. Just timing. Walter wired the money on a Tuesday in March, $240,000. By Wednesday, James Scott had moved it through 2 shell accounts and most of it was gone. By Friday, Walter called the number for Meridian Asset Partners and heard a recording that the number was no longer in service. Edna was in the garden when Walter came to the back door. She saw his face before he spoke. In 53 years of marriage, you learn to read a person's face the way you read a landscape, not just the surface of it, but the weather behind it, the pressure system moving in from somewhere you can't yet see. Walter's face in that moment was the face of a man standing in a place he did not recognize. "Edna," he said, "come inside." He told her everything. She sat at the kitchen table, and he stood because he couldn't sit down, and he told her about the wire transfer and the disconnected number and the website for Meridian Asset Partners that had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. Edna was quiet for a long time, long enough that Walter, who had been bracing for her response, found the silence harder than any response would have been. Finally, she said, "All of it?" "All of it," he said. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She looked at them. Walter had watched those hands for 53 years, had held them, had watched them bake and plant and fold in prayer and hold grandchildren, and he had never seen them look the way they looked right now, pressed flat and still, as if she were trying to keep the table from moving. "Okay," she said finally. Her voice was even. He knew what that cost her. They called their son David. David drove from Nashville in just under an hour. They filed a police report that afternoon. A detective named Randall, sympathetic and direct, told them that these cases were difficult. The money moved quickly through jurisdictions, and recovery was not common. He took all the information. He said he would be in touch. David stayed the night. He sat at the kitchen table with his father long after Edna had gone to bed, and Walter watched his son try to hold his anger steady for his father's sake, which was its own kind of heartbreak. "I told you, Dad," David said, not unkindly, with the anguish of someone who wishes he had been wrong. "I told you." "You did," Walter said. There was nothing to add to that. He went to bed at midnight and lay in the dark next to Edna, who was not asleep but was pretending to be because she needed the quiet, and he stared at the ceiling and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt old, not in his body, in his soul, as if something that had been keeping him upright, not pride exactly, but some structural confidence in his own judgment, his own discernment, his ability to read a person correctly, had been pulled out without warning, and his whole frame had settled an inch. He had been taken, completely, deliberately, expertly taken, and the worst of it, the part that would take the longest to work through, was not the money. It was that he had liked the man. He had trusted him. He had extended the basic Christian presumption of good faith, and someone had used it as a weapon against him. He lay there in the dark and listened to Edna not sleeping beside him, and thought about 40 years of work. He did not pray that night. That was new. He had prayed every night for as long as he could remember. He just lay there in the dark, feeling old, and said nothing to anyone. Pastor Nathaniel Broom had been the senior pastor of Grace Hills Seventh-day Adventist Church for 17 years. He was a deliberate, careful man, not slow, but unhurried, the way a deep river is unhurried, with the sense of considerable force moving beneath a calm surface. He had a gift for saying the true thing without making the person receiving it feel reduced by it, which is a rarer gift than it sounds. He came to the Moseley house on Thursday morning, not because anyone called him. Edna had told Sister Grace from the hospitality committee what had happened, and Sister Grace had told the pastor with the speed and accuracy of a woman who understood what information required action. He brought nothing. No casserole, no pamphlet, no prescribed pastoral response. He came with himself and a Bible he'd been carrying for 20 years that was held together at the spine by tape and intention. He sat with Walter and Edna in the living room, and he listened. He let Walter tell the whole story, including the part about liking James Scott, which Walter had not been able to say out loud yet, and which, in the saying of it, broke something open in him that needed to be broken open. When Walter finished, Pastor Broom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He chose you specifically because of who you are, because of the trust you carry. He looked at your faith and your decency, and he saw an opening." He paused. "That is not a reflection of your foolishness, Walter. That is a reflection of his sickness." Walter looked at him. "This man is sick," Pastor Broom said, "not in a way that removes his responsibility, in a way that means he is living a life completely empty of the things that make your life worth living. Genuine relationship, conscience, love, the ability to trust or be trusted. He took your money, but he is the one who is poor." Edna reached across and took Walter's hand. Pastor Broom opened his Bible to Matthew 5:44. He read it quietly. "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." "I'm not going to tell you to feel that today," he said. "I'm not going to tell you that forgiveness means what he did was acceptable, or that the money doesn't matter, or that you should smile through this. None of that is true." He closed the Bible gently. "I'm going to tell you that this verse is in here because Jesus knew this exact situation. He knew that the hardest command, the one that costs the most, is this one. And he gave it to us anyway, because he knew what carrying unforgiveness would do to the person carrying it." He looked at them both. "You don't have to forgive him today, but I want you to know that the path through this, not around it, through it, goes in that direction." He stayed for 2 hours. He prayed with them before he left, a prayer that was honest and specific and did not pretend that everything was fine, because Pastor Nathaniel Broom's prayers never pretended anything. After he left, Edna said, "I believe him." Walter said, "I know, so do I." He didn't feel it yet, but he believed it. And Pastor Broom had told them once from the pulpit that belief comes before feeling in the kingdom of God, that you decide first and the heart follows the decision, that faith is not the feeling, faith is the walk. He decided to walk toward it. 6 weeks after the wire transfer, Detective Randall called. They had found James Scott, not through the Moseley case as it turned out, through a 41-year-old woman in Memphis named Carol Hutchins, who had lost $87,000 to the same operation, and who, unlike Walter, had kept meticulous records of every call, every email, every document, with the organized fury of a woman who had worked in accounting for 20 years and was not going to let this go without making it as difficult as possible for everyone involved. Carol Hutchins had also hired a private investigator, which was how the physical location of James Scott's rented office space had been identified, which was what gave Detective Randall the jurisdictional thread he needed to pull. James Scott was arrested on a Wednesday morning at the business center. He was calm during the arrest, which the arresting officers noted. Not hostile, not panicked, calm. With the regulated affect of someone who had considered this possibility and had prepared an emotional response to deploy when needed, he was charged with wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and securities fraud across 3 states. There were, it emerged during the investigation, 11 confirmed victims, most of them elderly, most of them churchgoers, most of them people of evident decency who had been specifically selected because decency in James Scott's operational framework was exploitable. The total amount stolen was north of $1.4 million. He had recovered and hidden approximately $900,000. The rest, including Walter and Edna's $240,000, had been spent on the BMW, on a rented house, on dinners and clothes and the maintenance of an appearance of prosperity that was, in every particular, constructed on other people's suffering. Walter and Edna received a letter from the district attorney's office informing them of the case and asking whether they wished to provide a victim impact statement at sentencing. David, their son, said he would write it. He was ready. He had things to say. Edna said, "I think your father should write it." David looked at his father. Walter was at the kitchen table with his Bible open and his coffee going cold. He had been reading Matthew 5 again. He'd been reading it for 2 weeks, actually, returning to it the way you return to something you're trying to understand, not just with your mind, but with the rest of you. He said, "I'll write it." David waited to hear what his father was going to say. He expected anger, righteous, justified anger, the kind a jury would understand and a judge would weigh. What Walter said was, "I'm going to tell him something he hasn't heard before." The sentencing hearing was held on a Friday morning in April. The courtroom was full, 11 victims or their representatives, family members, local media, because the scope of the fraud and the number of elderly victims had drawn attention. Detective Randall in the 3rd row, Carol Hutchins, who had driven from Memphis and who Walter had spoken to twice by phone, and who had, he thought, one of the finest fighting spirits he had encountered in a long time. James Scott sat at the defense table in a suit that no longer looked impressive, flanked by his attorney. He looked the same. That was the disconcerting thing. He looked exactly the same as the photographs Walter had seen online. Presentable, calm. The broad smile absent, but its infrastructure still visible in the arrangement of his face, ready to be deployed. He had pled guilty as part of a negotiated arrangement. He was facing a significant sentence. Several victims read impact statements. They were devastating in the ordinary way, not theatrical, not designed for effect, just the plain accounting of damage. A 78-year-old widower who had to move in with his daughter, a retired nurse who could no longer afford her medication without assistance, Carol Hutchins, who read hers with the precision and composure of someone who had edited it 17 times and was not going to give this man the satisfaction of her tears in a public courtroom. Then Walter Moseley stood up. He was wearing his church clothes, not because Edna had told him to, but because he had decided on his own that this was a day that warranted them. He looked at the paper in his hand. He looked at James Scott. James met his eyes briefly, then looked away. That was new. He had not looked away from anyone before. Walter said, "My name is Walter Moseley. I'm 74 years old. I was married to my wife Edna for 53 years last November. We worked for everything we had. We didn't have much that was fancy, but what we had was real. Real work, real savings, real trust in people. Because that's how we were raised and how we raised our children and how we taught our grandchildren to move in the world." He paused. The courtroom was very quiet. "You took our savings, $240,000. I want the court to know what that money was. It was not a number. It was 30 years of my knees. It was my wife's 30 years of library work. It was the vacation we never took, the kitchen we never renovated, the things we chose not to have so we could have something real at the end." He paused again. "You took that. I want that on record." Another pause, then, "I also want this on record. My pastor gave me a verse 2 months ago, Matthew 5:44, 'Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.' I've been reading it for 8 weeks trying to figure out if I was capable of it. I'm not going to tell you I'm there yet, but I'm walking toward it." He looked directly at James Scott. "I am going to pray for you, James, not because you deserve it, because Jesus told me to, and I trust him more than I trust what I'm currently feeling." He folded the paper. "You are 34 years old. You have made choices that have emptied your life of anything real. I don't know what's inside you, but I know what's available to you, and I'm praying you find it." He sat down. Edna took his hand under the table. The courtroom took a moment to remember how to breathe. James Scott was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. As the officers moved to escort him from the courtroom, he paused, just briefly, and looked back at where Walter and Edna sat. His face did something in that moment that his face had not been doing for the entirety of the proceeding. Something shifted in it, small, involuntary, the expression of someone who has been struck by something they didn't see coming. He turned away. He was walked out of the courtroom. Walter watched him go. He felt to his own considerable surprise, not triumph, not closure, not even relief. He felt sorrow, deep, clean, genuine sorrow for a 34-year-old man walking out of a courtroom toward 9 years of consequence for a life lived completely empty of the things that make life worth living. He thought about what Pastor Broom had said. He is the one who is poor. He had thought he understood that when Pastor Broom said it. He understood it better now. The Mosleys did not recover their money. The $900,000 recovered from James Scott's hidden accounts was distributed across 11 victims in proportions determined by the courts. Walter and Edna received approximately $63,000, meaningful, not sufficient, not nothing. Their daughter Renee, who lived in Atlanta, quietly set up an automatic monthly transfer that she did not announce and did not ask permission for. David did the same. Walter discovered it 3 months later when he looked at his bank statement and spent an entire afternoon sitting with the complicated feeling of being loved well by your children. The cruise happened, not next spring, 2 springs later, a 7-day Caribbean itinerary that Walter researched so thoroughly that Edna told him he had absorbed enough information to apply for a position on the ship. It was not the cruise of their original imagining, funded by an untouched retirement account. It was smaller, shorter, and significantly more meaningful because they were on it, and they were together, and the thing that had tried to break them had not succeeded. They continued at Grace Hills. continued being Walter and Edna Moseley, she running the hospitality committee with slightly more controlled ferocity about double-checking vendors and partners, he reading his Bible in the recliner by the garden window every morning, his coffee black and hot. He added James Scott to his morning prayers, every morning, not because it was easy, because he had decided to walk toward it, and the walk required putting one foot in front of the other, regardless of whether you felt like moving. He walked. 2 years and 4 months after the sentencing, Walter received a letter. He almost didn't open it. The return address was a federal correctional facility in Georgia, and his first instinct, the instinct of a man who had been taken by a professional, was to set it down and call his son. Instead, he sat with it for a moment in the recliner by the window, the garden visible beyond the glass, full and green in the June light, and then he opened it. The handwriting was neat. Not the handwriting of performance and the kind that announces itself, but the careful, slightly effortful handwriting of someone who had practiced it, which he would later learn was exactly what had happened. It read, "Mr. Moseley, I don't expect you to write back. I'm not writing because I expect anything. I'm writing because I have been trying to find a way to say something true for 2 years, and this is the best I've got. I have been in here for 2 years and 4 months. For the first 14 months, I told myself the same things I always told myself, that the world is a transaction, that everyone is running a game, that I was just better at it. I was good at telling myself that. I had a lot of practice. Something happened 14 months ago that I can't explain completely. A chaplain here, a Seventh-day Adventist pastor actually, which I thought was a strange coincidence until I stopped believing in coincidences, started a Bible study in this facility. I went the first time because I was bored. I went the second time because something he said bothered me and I wanted to argue with it. By the 6th time, I had run out of arguments. He read us Matthew 5:44 one evening. He talked about it for a long time, and then he mentioned that he had spoken to a man who had been defrauded out of his life savings, and that this man was praying for the person who had done it. He didn't say my name. He didn't say your name. He was just talking about what forgiveness costs someone, and why someone would choose it anyway. I knew he was talking about you. I don't know what you feel when you read this. I don't know if you feel anything or if you threw this letter away, which would be reasonable. What I want to say is, I understood for the first time in that Bible study that I am not pragmatic. I am empty. I spent 34 years constructing reasons why the way I lived was logical, and I never once considered that what I actually was someone who had never been loved correctly and had decided that meant love wasn't real. I'm not saying this to get sympathy. I'm saying it because the chaplain told me that truth is the beginning of everything, and I've been living without it for so long that writing it down feels like learning a new language. I'm sorry, those words don't carry what I need them to carry, but they're the truest ones I have. I found something in here. I don't know how to describe it, except to say that the emptiness has an answer. I didn't think it did. I was wrong about that, the way I was wrong about almost everything. James Scott. Walter read the letter twice. Then he put it down on the side table next to his cold coffee and looked out at the garden for a long time. Edna came in from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel, and saw his face. 53 years of marriage, 55 now, had given her fluency in every version of his expression. "What is it?" she said. He handed her the letter. She stood in the middle of the living room and read it. He watched her face move through something, not simple forgiveness, not easy grace, but the complicated, layered response of a woman who had planted something painful 2 years ago and was now, unexpectedly, watching it come up. When she finished, she sat down on the couch. "He found Christ," she said. "It sounds like it," Walter said. A long silence. "In a federal prison," she said, "through a Seventh-day Adventist chaplain." She looked at her husband. "Through your impact statement." Walter was quiet for a moment. "You know what this means," Edna said, "not a question." "I have to write back," Walter said. He got up from the recliner. He went to the desk in the small room they called the study. He found a notepad and a pen. He sat down. He looked at the blank page for a while. Then he wrote, "James, thank you for writing. I want to tell you about Matthew 5:44, what it cost me and what it gave back." He wrote for an hour. Outside the study window, the garden was doing what gardens do in June, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully producing the thing it was always going to produce, now that it had been given the right conditions. Walter had planted the seeds 2 years ago in a federal courtroom in his church clothes. He had not known what would grow. He knew now. In due season, as someone had once written to a church in Galatia, "We will reap if we do not give up." Walter Moseley had not given up. Neither, it turned out, had James Scott, and the God who is in the business of making something from nothing, of finding people in the powder, of opening doors in the rain, of planting seeds in courtrooms, that God had been at work in both of them. Simultaneously, without either of them fully knowing it, until now. On a Saturday morning in October, 3 years after the sentencing, Pastor Nathaniel Broom stood at the front of Grace Hill's Seventh-day Adventist Church and announced, with the careful, quiet joy of a man delivering news he has been holding for a long time, that a member of their extended community had been baptized the previous week at a correctional facility in Georgia by the Adventist chaplain on staff. He didn't give the name. He didn't need to. Walter and Edna Moseley sat in their regular pew, third from the front, left side, which they had occupied for 31 years, and Edna reached over and took Walter's hand. He held it. Outside the windows of Grace Hills, the Tennessee October was doing its extravagant thing. The maples on the property had gone full gold and amber, the sky behind them the particular shade of blue that only exists in autumn, too clear and too deep to look at for long. Walter thought about a 34-year-old man in Georgia learning to hold a Bible the way a man learns to hold something fragile that he has just been given, carefully, with the new and serious understanding of its value. He thought about Matthew 5:44, the enemy, the prayer, the cost of it, and the gift of it, and the fact that Jesus had put it in there because he knew, he always knew, that the command that costs the most is the one that returns the most in ways and in timing that you cannot predict and would not have chosen, and that are, when they finally arrive, more than you had thought to ask for. He thought about $240,000. He thought about what it had purchased. He decided it had purchased something more valuable than a cruise, though the cruise had been wonderful, and he recommended it to anyone. He opened his Bible. He read, "The maple light came through the window and lay across the page in long gold panels. It was a very good morning to be alive. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Matthew 5:44. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe, and turn on the notifications to be notified about more inspirational stories on redemption and hope. Share with your loved ones. Financial scams targeting seniors are real and increasing. If you or someone you love has been targeted, contact the National Elder Fraud Hotline, 1-833-FRAUD-11. The end.